good evening to all of you. It's very nice to meet you, fellow evaluators and climate change and development experts and practitioners. This is session 14 of the Asian Evaluation Week 2022. And the session title is Making Climate Finance and Adaptation Work for the Small Island Developing States and the Least Developed Countries, Lessons Learned from Evaluations. This is a session organized by the Green Climate Fund's Independent Evaluation Unit, IEU, and I have the privilege of moderating this session. My name is Yeonji Kim, and I am Communications Officer at the GCF Independent Evaluation Unit. We are very happy that you joined us today. We have a rich program that we prepared for you, and I would like to quickly explain to you what we have in store. So first, after my introduction is over, we would have two presentations by the IEU, and one of my colleagues would talk about some key lessons learned and takeaways from the IEU's recently concluded independent evaluations of the relevance and effectiveness of the GCF's investments in the SIDS and the LDCs. These are actually two separate evaluations, but we'll be combining the two and present some key takeaways. And then it'll be followed by another quick presentation by my colleague, and it'll be about the independent evaluation of the GCF's adaptation portfolio and approach. Then I'm really thrilled that we have a rich panel today, and we have 4 panelists joining us from various types of organizations and sectors. And so we would get to hear from them, giving a country perspective and also a perspective of bilateral climate finance, cooperation, and then also from a multilateral climate fund perspective, and as an association that supports several member countries. And so we would have a panel discussion of about 40 minutes, and then we would turn to a moderated Q&A. And for this, I encourage you to send us your questions and comments through your Q&A box, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible throughout the event, but mostly from during the Q&A session at the end. And we will wrap up in the end and close this event. So without further ado, since we have many speakers for this event, let me introduce you my esteemed IEU colleagues who will give us their presentations. First, we will hear from Mr. Susumu Yoshida. He is an evaluation specialist at the IEU, and he manages and implements the IEU's learning-oriented real-time impact assessment program. In short, we call that LORTA. He has more than 15 years of international experience in development research and operations. Prior to the IEU, he worked at the World Bank's Development Impact Evaluation as an operations officer. Next, you'll hear from Dr. Anastasia Aladysheva, my colleague from the IEU, and she is an impact evaluation officer at the unit. And she also supports and leads the IEU LORTA program. Before joining the IEU, she worked in the field of impact evaluations of development, humanitarian, and peace-building programs for over 10 years. And then my name is Yeonji Kim, of course, and I am your moderator for this session. So without further ado, let me quickly invite Susumu to do his presentation. So over to you, Susumu.
Okay, thank you, Yeonji. Hi, everyone. I'm Susumu Yoshida from Independent Evaluation Unit of Green Climate Fund. Thank you for joining this session today. So I'm going to talk about 2 evaluations of which we recently conducted. But before going to the evaluation, let me start with the institutional background. So as you may know, Green Climate Fund is the largest climate fund, which was set up by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2010, with its mission of supporting developing countries to transition to low emission and climate resilient societies. And how we do it? We use the term paradigm shift. And there are 4 pathways to do it. And starting from establishing enabling environment for climate solutions, which includes capacity building of policymakers and the local actors. And then GCF pilot new technologies, business models, and the financing instrument and the practices to establish a proof of concept. And GCF also mobilized finance at scale by using public resource to de-risk market and creating project. And also this includes including crowding in private finance to create a new market. And of course, lastly, it's strengthening the financial institutions. And we, at the Independent Evaluation Unit, we have a mandate to inform the board by independently evaluating the and assess the performance and result of the GCF. And also, by the way, we are currently conducting a second performance review, which will be available sometime soon, so stay tuned. And we conduct various other evaluations. So today I'm going to talk about the evaluation of effectiveness and relevance of the GCF investment in small island developing states and least developed countries. And my colleague Anastasia is going to talk about adaptation portfolio and approaches. So starting with the SIDS evaluation, the evaluation team identified 5 critical factors, which are need for flexibility, capacity constraints, urgency of climate action, high transaction and operational cost, and the importance of adaptation. So for the sake of time, let me jump straight into the key findings, starting from urgency. So our evaluation concluded that the GCF modalities and the processes are not very efficient or effective to address urgency. By the way, this is not for SIDS context, but the LDCs and then the overall GCF member countries, other countries as well. This has some caveat on this because the GCF focus on the capacity, country ownership, and also the capacity development of the partners, which takes a lot of time. And so it has a trade-off between urgency and the trade-off. But the Secretariat and the board is aware of this challenge, and there are some attempts to address these issues. And also like some attempt to simplify some approval process. We call it the SAP, and to start with. And it shows some progress, but still needs to be done. And the second point is accreditation. Accreditation is the unique and the core of the GCF approach. So we rely on the project development and the project implementation by the accredited entities. But due to the low capacity and limited experience of the SIDS countries, these SIDS countries have some disadvantage in getting accreditation. So this goes same for the LDC countries. It has some capacity constraint, which goes to the next point of capacity. And not only getting accreditation, but limited capacity to develop the concept note and the funding proposal is the barrier to access finance at the GCF. Okay, so the adaptation, since Anastasia is going to talk about, I'm going to skip that and go to the next point of the private sector. So far the GCF approach is not very effective or find a way to mobilize in the private sector fully. So again, the GCF, the Secretariat is aware of it, and then and still needs some room to tackle on this aspect. And the last part is policy space. So GCF policy and the framework leave room for potential flexibility for SIDS countries. But this lack of guidance and possesses risk for misinterpretation and misapplication. So it has some challenges. So I just briefly summarized 200 pages report in 2 minutes. I think I did a good job in doing that. But of course, if you are interested in, you can download the full report from our website and take a look. And I'm hoping while I'm talking, some of my colleagues is going to put the link in the chat box for easy access. And for the LDC evaluation, similarly, we have like 5 areas to evaluate. And starting with the access to GCF support, again, the same thing, the LDC countries have difficulties in accessing the GCF support due to the processes and then the structural barriers, especially for direct access entry. These are the domestic entities. To give some ideas that to get accreditation for direct access entities, on Medium, it was taking like 688 days to get the accreditation for direct access entities. Although the regional, it was 317, and the international entity, it was 490. So overall, it's taking time, but the domestic direct access entities, it was taking more. And the next point is a structural barrier, again, to procedural bottleneck and limit NDA's role. There's some like attempt to facilitate this process called RPSP, which is Readiness and Preparatory Support Program to help develop the funding proposal and access. So it has some attempt, but still the disbursement is very slow, and especially for adaptation planning. And then the LDC have only 14 national direct access entities, which is focusing on the micro and the small and low risk, relatively small risk projects, and have difficulty in the getting access to the medium and the large projects. And since this is evaluation week, I think the audience is evaluation folks. So I wanted to focus on the issue of the project monitoring and then the verification of measuring the result. This is not from the GCF side, but from the operational side, the country side. It has a very limited capacity to collect the data and monitor data and measure the result. And again, Secretariat is aware of this, and we are trying to deploy some guidance and then the new integrated result measurement frameworks, and then also the how to use it. So it's on the way to help the capacity development of the partners. So I think I want to emphasize the importance of the coherence and the complementarity of the finance. So it's not only GCF, but the other climate financiers like Jeff and Adaptation Fund. And today we have Sarah from SIF is joining the session. So I think it's not just GCF, but we have to think how to work coherently and then by complementing each other to tackle this climate agenda. Thank you very much. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Susumu, for being on time. And it was a very interesting and informative presentation. So as Anastasia gets ready for her presentation, yes, we look forward to hearing, about the findings from the IEU's evaluation of the GCF's adaptation portfolio and approach. So Anastasia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Yonji. I hope you can all hear me well, and thank you very much, Susumu, for this excellent presentation. So I would like to continue with a short presentation of the results from the independent evaluation of the adaptation portfolio and approach of the Green Climate Fund. This evaluation was approved by the board as the part of the IEU's work plan in autumn 2019 and was delivered by B28 in winter 2021. So many former and current IEU colleagues were part of this evaluation, and I just have a privilege to present it on behalf of the team. The key evaluation question is, what does it take for the GCF to contribute to a paradigm shift in adaptation? And to answer this question, the evaluation adopted mixed method approach with qualitative and quantitative data collection methods, desk reviews, various interviews, country case studies, and deep dives. For example, for this evaluation, data were collected in such countries as Gambia, Uganda, Tajikistan, Kenya, Guatemala, Morocco, and Namibia. The scope of this evaluation is rather wide. It looks at the position of the GCF in wider landscape and its role, evaluates GCF adaptation portfolio, adaptation planning and capacity of the funded countries, private sector engagement, GCF business model, and results and impact. The findings that are presented in this slide are all very relevant for African states, as well as small island development states and least developed countries. As it's suggested by the GCF governing instrument, GCF has a special role in adaptation finance. And among other climate funds, it can finance projects with high risk appetite. And the fact that adaptation per se is not explicitly defined in GCF or governing instrument, it gives some sort of flexibility and promotes country ownership. It motivates countries to develop projects that are specifically relevant to their national agenda. And as Susumu mentioned, in terms of complementarity and coherence, however, there is little effort done in terms of project level interactions with other funds, and there is still work to be done in this area. The evaluation finds, and many of our IU evaluation find the same, so that the requirements for proposals, capacity concerns, and matchmaking with adequate delivery partners are seen as hurdles, for example, in assessing readiness grants for adaptation planning. The approval process for readiness grants varies from 14 days to 3 years. And in terms of the impacts, fully attributing GCF readiness to concrete outcomes is challenging, as well as assessing its quality. In terms of the private sector engagement, among other climate funds, the GCF has the strongest private sector focus and best ability to scale projects. However, the co-financing is very limited. Only 80 cents, so this is the data from November 2020, only 80 cents are generated as co-finance per $1 of GCF. Right now, this figure is higher, and as my colleague said yesterday, it's now $2.2 US per one GCF dollar. So it's higher after approval of 3 private sector projects at B33. Of course, not all financial instruments are fully utilized. Most are grants, and I will show on the next slide the picture. But this also largely depends on the level of development of financial system of the funded countries. Especially this is relevant for the least developed countries where their financial systems is very weak. Finally, within the GCF operations and internally within GCF, we find that more synergy between private sector facility and Department of Mitigation Adaptation would be important in the reviewing the project proposals, bringing adaptation and mitigation balance, balancing the choice of financial instruments. So this is more synergy, more fruitful communication is important. A few important findings on the portfolio. The adaptation portfolio consists of very few programs. So there are 4 programs out of and 67 projects. Most are relatively small scale projects. Grants dominate the portfolio. And also the portfolio is dominated by international accredited entities. So these are mostly United Nations agencies. We also find that adaptation projects take longer to process than mitigation projects. And this is especially for the direct access entities. The reasons for the delays include availability of data, lack of guidance of climate rationale, and actually complexity of giving the climate rationale to GCF and analysis of that. The complexity of adaptation projects in comparison to the mitigation project. One important point that was highlighted is that adaptation is a kind of a cross-cutting concept. It crosses through development aid, humanitarian assistance, and of course, specifically climate-focused finance. So the complexity of adaptation projects seems to be higher than that of mitigation projects because there are so many components to take into account. The GCF has challenges and still has challenges reaching the most vulnerable and least ready countries. So for example, as of the data from 2020, 59 countries received no GCF adaptation finance. So these are 2 pictures from the report, 2 graphs. So you can see that on the right-hand side, that 41% of adaptation finance, for example, go to Africa, 43% go to Asia Pacific, only 2% goes to Eastern Europe, and 15% go to Latin America and the Caribbean. And on the right side, you can see that most financial instruments are grants. The non-grant level is increasing. However, it's still relatively small. The graph is not updated until today, but the trend is evident from this graph. And you can see that grants dominate the financial instruments kind of modality. Finally, in terms of measuring impacts, so GCF doesn't yet have a systematic way of measuring the results. One reason for that is, of course, not many projects are finalized yet, so that's nothing yet to measure. Many projects are very new in operations, but also measuring impacts could be very challenging, as well as attributing those impacts to the specific projects or program is not easy. It requires good quality data, analytical capacities, and of course, finance. And the pandemic made things quite difficult. Sometimes we can measure a number of direct and indirect beneficiaries, but that's not precise at GCF. We can try and measure impacts of smaller of components of the projects with some tangible outcomes. But measuring the whole project or specifically, or even program, specifically program, that may also have, for example, a policy component is extremely difficult. One idea is to look at some sectoral impacts and compare them with other funds, which is still difficult. But of course, there are certain gaps. Some results areas, for example, are never mentioned in the project proposal, for example, health. So there's definitely more work to do in this area. So there are various recommendations, and I will not go through all the recommendations one by one, but all these recommendations are linked to the points and key findings that were mentioned in these presentations. And of course, we welcome everyone to visit our webpage and find our report there. It has both short and long versions, so you can find all these key recommendations over there. Thank you, and over to you, Yonji.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. It was also very interesting. So now I think we can move on to the panel discussion, but it doesn't mean we are not going to see our two lead presenters again. I'm sure when we do the Q&A, we would have an opportunity to hear from them as well. And yes, for the panel discussion, I am really excited because now that we've heard the two scene setting presentations, we are going to get more specific and have an in-depth discussion about how we can really make climate finance and adaptation work for these highly vulnerable countries like the SIDS and the LDCs, and these, sector specialists, evaluation specialists, they will be able to share with us their relevant, lessons learned. And so I'm really excited about this. So first, we will hear from Dr. Christopher Bartlett, who is Climate Diplomacy Manager of the government of Vanuatu. And Dr. Bartlett is also the lead negotiator on loss and damage for the Republic of Vanuatu. So welcome, Christopher, and yeah, we will hear from you shortly. And then we have Dr. Martin Noltz with us from the German Institute for Development Evaluation, or DEVAL. And Dr. Noltz is a team leader at DEVAL's Competence Center for Evaluation Methodology. And so he works on the advancement of evaluation standards and designs in the field of development evaluation. Next, we have Ms. Sarah Moin with us, who is Program Officer with the Climate Investment Fund, CIF. And she provides research, analytical, and coordination support to the Transformational Change Learning Partnership, or TCLP, as well. So welcome, Sarah. And we also have Mr. Unikrishnan Nair, who is Head of Climate Change at the Commonwealth Secretariat. And he looks after the climate change program of the Commonwealth Secretariat, leading its flagship program, the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub and the Commonwealth Living Lands Charter. So we will also hear from him in how the Commonwealth Secretariat is supporting its 56 member countries. So now, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Christopher Bartlett to tell us about how, especially the IEU SIDS evaluation has been really relevant to his work, and some insights as to how he's been supporting the adaptation and loss and damage related work for the government of Vanuatu. So Christopher, over to you.
Thank you very much, colleagues and friends. And I bring you greetings from the people and the government of Vanuatu. And thanks very much to the Asian Evaluation Week organizers for this opportunity to give you insights on how Vanuatu, as a small island developing state, is approaching climate finance and our work on adaptation. So first, I can't emphasize enough that as we meet today, unfortunately, Vanuatu, and in fact, all nations are in the midst of a climate emergency. And it really does appear to us that there is no end in sight. Fossil fuel emissions continue to rise, along with the deep suffering of our people. The leaders of the Pacific Island Forum have called climate change the single greatest threat to our well-being and livelihoods. And the truth is that after 30 years of climate change negotiation, emissions are rising. Emitters seem not to be acting in good faith, not responding to the warning from scientists, still delaying and deferring action, and not investing the trillions that are truly required to change the trajectory towards resilience. This, to us, is unacceptable. And without the promised finance for climate change, people are losing their traditional lands. We're losing our sovereign national boundaries, and human rights are being compromised and undermined. With the fact that Vanuatu has been ranked again as the most at-risk nation in the world to the effects of climate change, and this is multiple years in a row, and we're facing the entire range of climate impacts, from the collapse of our agricultural systems, the lack of just drinking water, the spread of pest and disease like malaria and dengue, landslides, all of this due to the shifting rainfall patterns that we're experiencing here in the islands. Of course, we're also experiencing the widespread death of our coral reefs because of ocean acidification and bleaching. And you're well aware of the catastrophic cyclones and, of course, sea level rise that is affecting us here in the Pacific as just some of the climate change impacts that we face. And these are not least of which due to the very unique context of small island developing states in general. The Pacific Islands have very unique geographic and socioeconomic contexts. We're low-lying, we're isolated, we have small land area separated by vast oceans, high population concentrations, and of course, extremely high costs of living and costs to provide basic services to our people, which puts us in a unique situation and a unique need for climate finance. Unfortunately, the estimates for the finance needed for the entire Pacific is around $1 billion annually. But currently, the Pacific is receiving flows of only around 220 million annually. So you can see that there is a huge gap in the needs and the access for implementing our key climate priorities. Also, sadly, only 2% of the global climate finance flows have made their way to the Pacific, and the vast majority of these flows are for mitigation and through loan instruments. And so we are going into debt in order to avoid economic collapse because of a problem that we're not responsible for. I'd like us to take a look at the graphic just to give you an idea of the scale of climate finance that we are facing and need in the Pacific. This is an image of two Category 5 cyclones which have struck Vanuatu in the last 7 years. The first cyclone, Pam, which in a matter of 3 or 4 hours wiped out 64% of our gross domestic product. And today, we still have not fully recovered from that cyclone because you can see on the slide that we received, although the economic damages were hundreds of millions, we've received less than 100 million in support, climate finance support for loss and damage and recovery. Just a few years ago, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, we were hit with Category 5 Cyclone Harold with even greater financial loss and damage. And again, the response, the climate finance, is minimal. The Green Climate Fund has mobilized substantial finance for Vanuatu, but it's less than $100 million since the beginning of the fund. And so you can see the dissonance there with the needs and the finance flows. So we took an evaluation with the Green Climate Fund in 2018, which was incredibly useful to identify some of the key barriers, challenges, but also opportunities for us to upscale the climate finance that we receive. And we came very quickly to the realization that to mobilize finance at the scale that's needed, both from the GCF, but of course all sources, Vanuatu very quickly needed to identify a whole of government and programmatic assessment of our climate finance needs. And we identified the fact that we needed to elevate sector leadership in our climate finance processes and put finance, and specifically the climate investment rationale, at the center of our national development planning process. And we decided to do this not as a standalone document, but as part and parcel, central in our nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, which is, as you know, the highest level document that countries can submit to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. At COP26, as you're aware, countries made a very high level commitment to, by the end of this year, revise and enhance their NDCs. And Vanuatu took that very seriously. And just last month, we became the 13th country in the world to do that. And we've made history in that our nationally determined contribution is not just about mitigation. In fact, it includes 148 climate commitments that we've made for lowering emissions, expanding adaptation, and addressing loss and damage. And very critically for this forum is that we have fully costed the implementation of that nationally determined contribution, which for Vanuatu is around $1.2 billion by 2030, with more than 700 million needed to invest in adaptation. What's particularly special about our NDC is that it is holistic and it has a comprehensive coverage of all sectors, particularly in adaptation and loss and damage. These sectors are already implementing adaptation with our own government recurrent budgets. In fact, 15% of our government recurrent budget for 2022 is going towards directly adaptation. And so this NDC truly maps and promotes how climate finance can actually flow to the priorities of our nation. I'd also like to highlight the fact that the evaluation showed us that policy ambition at the moment is insufficient globally. What is required is upscaled finance so that we can see deep, sustained, and socially just cuts to emissions now and not later. And this is why Vanuatu is stepping out as part of a coalition of more than 75 nations from around the world, particularly from the Caribbean, from Africa, and of course, all of the Pacific. And we are putting forward a resolution at the upcoming General Assembly's session of the United Nations, which is calling on the International Court of Justice to provide an advisory opinion on the obligations of states under all international laws to protect the rights of present and future generations against the adverse effects of climate change. Now, what is particularly unique here is that the international climate regime, including the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, is built on nationally determined priorities. However, human rights laws are universal and unambiguous. Protecting human rights is a fundamental legal obligation of all states. And so when human rights are violated, there are enforceable consequences. So to be very clear, the International Court of Justice campaign is not a court case. It's not taking anyone to court. There will be no winners and losers. What it will do, however, is provide legal clarity on how we can provide obligations under international law to build ambition in climate change. And that ambition extends, of course, to mobilizing finance. So we expect that this advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice will draw a very clear line between what is an acceptable outcome of climate negotiations, including finance, and what is a non-negotiable legal responsibility to prevent harm from climate change. So friends, I thank you very much again for the opportunity to highlight not only Vanuatu's unique vulnerabilities on climate change, but also some of the solutions that we are championing at the global level to truly address the consequences and minimize the impacts of this existential crisis. The time is now, and you have in Vanuatu the strongest ally for climate justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for that presentation. So yeah, now that the memory of your presentation is fresh, I want to ask you maybe, could you elaborate further on how an advisory opinion would motivate a greater ambition under the Paris Agreement? Is there a specific timeline that you're thinking about for action?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the advisory opinion will provide guidance to all states on how their legal obligations under human rights treaties, under environmental treaties, ocean treaties, for example, can be applied to action on climate change. And so what we expect is that the court's advisory opinion will motivate states to enhance the contributions of their NDCs. We also expect that the advisory opinion would encourage parliaments to appropriate more resources, adequate resources, to begin to protect people, ecosystems, and human rights from climate change because of those underlying international law obligations. So again, there will be no requirement. This is not about compensation or reparations. This is a forward-looking initiative to see if we can start to put the adequate amount of resources to addressing what is a human rights crisis.
Yeah, great. So I think if that goes through, it'll also mean a lot, I think, for GCF and other climate funds as well, since, we are serving the, Paris Agreement on climate change, but also the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so it'll be really interesting to see if the ICJ could indeed issue such an advisory opinion. Good luck on your campaign. And maybe the next question I could ask you is, by the way, congratulations on the revised and updated NDC of Vanuatu. That's truly exciting. How do you think the finance will be spent to address loss and damage in the context of this updated NDC?
Thank you for this question. I think at the moment, loss and damage, finance for loss and damage is a very topical area of discussion, and certainly in the negotiations. And one of the biggest questions we faced is, well, how do you propose to spend loss and damage finance that would be different, for example, to adaptation, or different, obviously, to mitigation? And what we've done in this NDC is made it very clear how Vanuatu intends to spend finance for loss and damage. A lot of the commitments that we've made are around the preparatory activities that need to be put in place. So, for example, doing the very long-term assessments of community risk. There are, most of the villages in Vanuatu will have to consider complete relocation because of their extremely prone location on coastlines, which are rapidly disappearing. And so that investment in loss and damage will be an opportunity for us to move or be displaced, but with dignity, so that we can adequately prepare in advance for the need to move. And so this is just one of the examples of how we could invest finance into loss and damage.
So you've costed the adaptation needs of Vanuatu as well in your NDC. So I know that our next speaker, Martin, would talk about the optimization of adaptation finance. So would you say that the adaptation finance that has flown to Vanuatu actually is in line with the vulnerability of Vanuatu itself and its needs, right? Or would you say there is a significant gap?
Yeah, I think the gap is absolutely clear. I mean, our finance needs for adaptation to 2030 are around 700 million, and we've received less than 100 million over the last 10 years for adaptation finance. So you can see that the scope for upscaling is essential. This will depend not only on the Green Climate Fund and the other funds under the UNFCCC mechanism, but a whole range of innovative and novel absolute transformation of the financial sector to make sure that it's not only our own government that's putting 15% of its resources into adaptation, but that the entire financial system is realigned to the current global crisis and situation on climate change.
All right, thank you for that. I think that gives us a nice segue into Dr. Knowles' presentation. So Martin, please go ahead. We are ready to hear from you on the perspective of the German assistance to developing countries. So go ahead.
Thank you so much, John G. And hello to everybody. And thank you so much, Christopher, for this very relevant and important perspective. And I will try to add on this now, moving the site, going to a donor perspective. And as I'm working for the German Institute for Development Evaluation, maybe some of you may know this institute, but I just want to highlight that this is an independent institute with the mandate to evaluate all German official development assistance, so independent of any ministry or implementing agency unit. So welcome to my presentation on how to optimize adaptation finance for vulnerable countries, findings from evaluating the German Development Corporation adaptation portfolio. And the title, How to Optimize, is already one of the main messages when evaluating the portfolio of one of the world's most important donors for adaptation finance, without questioning the relevance of the discussion about international finance in absolute terms. And thank you for highlighting also the finance gap, Christopher. In many cases, we argue it's also a matter of how to allocate and use available funding impactful and in line with the country needs. And with an aggregated volume of more than $70 billion between 2011 and 2020, based on the OECD data, and together with mitigation, a combined portfolio of international climate finance of more than $50 billion, which accounts roughly a quarter of all German official development assistance in this period. Germany became one of the most important donors for climate change adaptation interventions in the circle of the OECD member countries. And in line of this relevance, DEWAL started a modular evaluation of Germany's adaptation portfolio of climate change adaptation in 2019, which is still ongoing and will close with final reports early next year. And so we worked through different thematic modules in this multi-year evaluation, which were attached to the policy cycle of the COP negotiations with different thematic focus areas. And we worked with a range of methods at the portfolio level. On the one hand, worked together with the Green Climate Fund actually on an evidence gap map on the effectiveness of adaptation interventions on an international level. We did an allocation analysis, an evaluation synthesis based on evaluation reports by implementing agencies and systematic reviews based on scientific literature. And in addition, used in-depth case studies at the level of different instruments. And when it comes to the findings and the questions of the allocation of adaptation finance with regard to the German portfolio, we find actually that the vulnerability status is one of the main determinants for the dimension of need. So in particular, vulnerability increases the probability of partner countries for receiving adaptation finance by the German government. However, the level of vulnerability is not correlated with the amount of commitment. So this was something that was surprising to us. And we actually observed that compared to countries' vulnerability status, some countries received less funding than expected, while others received more. And this was against our initial expectation. And also some LDCs, and especially the group of the small island development states, received less funding than expected, giving the prioritization in German adaptation strategies. And this holded both for bilateral, but also for multilateral cooperation. We also find that donor herding was present. So Germany is more active and provides more funding in countries where many other donors are around. Plus, by analyzing or looking at the nationally determined contribution document of the countries, we identified a gap between the sectoral allocation patterns of the German portfolio and the partner countries' priorities mentioned in the NDCs. So, in light of additional findings about the effectiveness of Germany's adaptation portfolio, we identified room for improvement between the optimization of already available adaptation finance towards increasing the effectiveness of adaptation interventions. First, by strengthening the allocation of climate finance by looking more consequently on climate vulnerability, by ensuring donor complementarity and coherence, and by the alignment of instruments with broader risk management strategies, which are, at least for the German portfolio, still evolving. In order, on the other hand, to have enough funding available for the most effective instruments, and also for the increasing field of working on residual climate risk management strategies in light of the increasing role of losses and damages that were already mentioned also by Christopher in the case of Vanuatu. And this could be backed by a continued support of the very effective development cooperation in NDCs and also the national adaptation plans, especially on the financing side, which is becoming even more important today. Development of demand-oriented risk financing and risk management, as well as the integration of cross-cutting issues. And I think we hear something about gender later on, but we looked at human mobility, migration, for example, as well as conflict-sensitive and transformative adaptation interventions. And please let me close my brief presentation on this by saying thank you for your attention for this presentation, and also mention that all the reports and materials that came up in the course of our modular evaluation are publicly available at our website, www.dval.org. And thank you. Back to you, Jeonji.
Thank you very much, Martin. So I will ask you two questions, and you're welcome to answer them in one go. So in your words, so what was the most surprising, evaluative finding, or the most unexpected thing coming out of this evaluation? And also, what are the most important kind of tasks, that's ahead of you now that this evaluation is over? So those are the two questions. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeonji, for these questions. Actually, to be honest, there are quite a few lessons learned, but maybe one of the most unexpected lessons for our evaluation team, at least, was the importance of the evaluation time needed to spend on the conceptualization and theorizing adaptation interventions, especially in the young and emerging areas such as residual climate risk management, so the risks that remain after a range of available adaptation instruments are already in place, or in the field of transformative adaptation, where not only Germany, but also many other donors still lack strategic orientation, and implementing agencies continue working on their instruments. So this took up quite a lot of time. In those areas, we had to move actually from initially planned summative perspectives or ex-post evaluation perspectives to more formative theory building approaches. So we needed way more resources to engage with the stakeholders, provide feedback loops, expert talks, and literature research. So that just had some consequences for our evaluation process and others than initially expected. And we realized the relevance to also account for a double time lag. We are all aware of the methodological challenge of the long time horizons between adaptation interventions and the impacts to unfold. However, it seems that we sometimes are less aware of the time lag between strategic orientations and instrument development, and the time lag until pilots are conducted and interventions brought to the field, which means that when we actually able to look at the effectiveness and impacts of interventions that have been implemented, new strategies, safeguards, project proposals, etc., are already emerging, so posing challenges to the role of evaluation, I would say, for timely support to evidence-based decision-making. And maybe to end with, in our evaluation, we also looked at this challenge empirically. So the evidence gap map I mentioned earlier, we did together with the GCF. We identified remarkable evidence gaps in central parts of our intervention outcome matrix. So the relationships between different types of interventions and the respective outcomes, which represent large parts also of the German portfolio. And we combined this with information from German adaptation finance. And we actually found no statistical relationship between the available evidence and the allocation of climate finance to different instruments. So our argument is in circumstances where there is time for action, and it is as short as in the climate crisis, knowing what works becomes ever more important. And this may be the main task ahead. So to answer your second question, so contributing to evidence-based or evidence-informed decision-making in this very highly dynamic policy field of climate, in light of the tight international climate agenda, the annual negotiations, we have the COP negotiations coming up in November, especially in emerging areas like residual climate risk management or risk financing, insurances, or conflict-sensitive adaptation interventions. This is the main evaluative task, I think, lying ahead for all of us. So yeah, thank you, Jenny.
Thank you so much for that, takeaway. And so let's now turn to the SIF and see, how SIF has been supporting the SIDS and LDCs and perhaps, doing their adaptation projects as well. So Sarah, over to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this very important discussion. And speakers before me have shared some insights, and without a doubt, I think a lot of these resonate with the SIF's experience as well. I fundamentally believe that climate funds bear a responsibility to make sure that climate finance is working for the most vulnerable states and people. And in this regard, of course, SIDS and LDCs stand out in terms of their vulnerabilities. As Christopher was mentioning in his presentation, I mean, they can be caught in vicious circles of facing shocks due to climate disasters and then needing to rebuild, getting trapped in long-term debt, and then again, sort of before being able to enhance resilience in their economies and societies and being hit by another shock. So in light of this, I think the dedicated evaluation that was conducted by the GCF IEU is greatly appreciated, and it really throws light on the challenges that GCF and other climate funds can really help address. I've read this with much interest, and I want to extend my appreciation towards the authors and commissioners of these evaluations. I think SIF's thematic evaluative work also provides some lessons for SIDS and LDCs. So for example, our work on transformational change, but also other studies, such as an evaluation of SIF's programmatic approach and other program and project specific studies. So I'd like to share today a few findings and results based on some of this work. This first one is just a quick summary of the SIF's portfolio in SIDS and LDCs. Just to say that the SIF has projects across its 4 current programming areas of clean energy, energy access, resilience and forestry across SIDS and LDCs, and in grants and concessional financing, also leading to, of course, significant levels of co-financing in billions of dollars. So when we look at this portfolio, I think 3 key messages emerge. The first is the importance of a programmatic approach for SIDS and LDCs. The second, linked to a programmatic approach, is the need for flexibility in planning and implementation of investments. And the third is the need for funding to be directed towards building resilient infrastructure and strengthening institutions in their capacities. Lastly, I would just like to share the transformational change framework that is also now part of the investment criteria for all the new SIF programs, and that when applied to SIDS and LDCs to plan and select investments could also help attain the transformative change in these regions. So the programmatic approach, as I was mentioning, essentially implies achieving large-scale impacts through a series of interconnected projects instead of a project-by-project approach. So an important thing to note here is that the bulk of concessional finance for climate in SIDS tends to be allocated through large one-off projects. And some studies have found that over half of the resilience projects amount to less than $200,000 each, and which is not working. And when we think about large scale sort of fundamental changes needed to break the shock recovery and further debt cycles, is clearly not working. So the programmatic approach at the SIF essentially entails development of an investment plan that is country owned, also informed by multi-stakeholder consultations and associated with scaled up financing. It's a way to ensure that the traditional silos are sort of broken by bringing together different stakeholders to the table, including national and international stakeholders, such as different government ministries, different MDBs, and local communities and their representatives as well. So doing this really ensures, I think, alignment between national development plans and needs and the climate interventions. An example of this approach is the SIF's intervention in Jamaica, where investment planning process and resultant investments led to strengthening of institutional collaboration across the government. In particular, while recognizing the role of the planning agency on the resilience agenda, but also working in collaboration with other departments, such as the meteorological department that held more detailed information on climate impacts in Jamaica. Another quick example in SIF's is SIF's forestry program in Burkina Faso, where the programmatic approach essentially contributed to the participatory process in support of the national RED+ efforts and partnership building. And the investment planning process essentially enabled high-level political engagement and gave voice to responsible ministries who otherwise have limited sort of ability to convene intersectoral dialogue. The next point I wanted to emphasize is really the need for flexibility in planning and implementation. And the GCF-IEU evaluation also highlights this and goes into significant length sort of to explain what needs to be flexible. Essentially, we have to allow processes to be what they need to be in each country, which need not be the same. So allowing for that sort of level of flexibility is not just about making things easier, but also allowing experimentation and innovation, such as testing of new mechanisms as well. So born out of this flexibility are mechanisms such as the DGM, IPLCs, and the SIF. The DGM, with the dedicated grant mechanism, is a direct access financing mechanism that gives IPLCs ability to decide which projects to fund. So a learning review of this mechanism essentially concluded that it was leading to results through not only the project pathway, which entails implementation of actual projects selected by the IPLCs, but also through an empowerment pathway, through capacity building and creation of platforms where issues faced by the IPLCs could be raised at the national levels. So other examples of flexibility include changes needed after project endorsement due to evolving market dynamics, for instance. So in a resilience project implementation in Zambia, for instance, resources meant for private sector focused projects were later reallocated to another program on community-based adaptation after appropriate private sector partners could not be found. However, as the GCF-IEU evaluation also discusses, current flexibility in climate funds is only going so far. When flexibility is needed all the way from project selection from program selection to program design, M&E, and throughout the project cycle. So the evaluation suggestion to do further sort of analysis on this flexibility is really well received. And if this work is undertaken, we will also be the direct consumers of the learning that comes out of it. The third point I wanted to make is really the focus on resilient infrastructure. And here what we have found is that it is not just direct infrastructure investments that are showing results, such as, say, climate proofing critical infrastructure, including roads, hospitals, emergency facilities, but also associated upstream and downstream support, such as risk assessments, guidance, developing standards, and downstream work that includes supporting livelihoods and engagement at the policy level. So key lessons being learned include the need to engage communities throughout infrastructure development to really capitalize on their knowledge and skills. Lastly, I wanted to share the transformational change dimensions that we at the SIF have developed through the Transformational Change Learning Partnership, which is essentially a collaborative learning effort led by the SIF, engaging over 600 plus organizations and 600 plus individuals and 250 plus organizations, including partners from the GCF-IEU, to really help understand what transformational change is and how to plan for it. These dimensions can essentially be used for program and project planning, designing, implementing, and evaluating. And I think they hold particular importance for vulnerable countries as well. The framework has 5 dimensions, as you can see, and I'll speak to each of these briefly. Relevance, which is the alignment of interventions with goals and context. So to put it simply, it involves asking, are we walking the right path, and is that path sound over time? So for SIDS and LDCs in particular, I think this implies asking what types of investments in, say, infrastructure, capacity development, institutional strengthening are most aligned with the country's priorities, especially those related to long-term resilience building. The second dimension of systemic change implies fundamental shifts in systems, structures, and functions, and hence this dimension really forces one to answer what are the systems that are required to change. These systems could be social, financial, technological, or governance related. So for SIDS and LDCs in particular, we have to ask questions such as what policies and regulations can enhance, for example, mainstreaming of resilience and lead to that level of diversification. Speed, which implies that we align our efforts with the urgency and complexity of the climate crisis, but we do so in a socially inclusive way. Scale, which asks essentially, what are the contextually large changes needed and how will we scale up these changes? This could be increasing the number of people in regions benefiting, scaling up public and private investments, or enhancing national budgets, and really driving forward innovations and deepening capacity support for example, again, resilience mainstreaming. And lastly, adaptive sustainability, which refers to the robustness and resilience of change, and hence ask what changes need to be sustained beyond the planned intervention, and how will this be done? So for SIDS and LDCs in particular, this will be important for interventions to build sort of sufficient capacity and resilience for the change to be sustained in the face of multiple environmental shocks, as I was mentioning. So these dimensions are essentially interrelated, but together they can help develop more robust and effective programs and projects in both SIDS and LDCs. So with those key messages and a few sort of reactions to the evaluation that I shared, I'd like to say thank you for allowing me to share the SIDS experience. And over to you, Hyunji.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And yes, I will ask you just one question given the time constraints, and we still have one more panelist. So you spoke earlier about the importance of mid-course correction and reallocation of funding, especially when it comes to adaptation projects. Could you perhaps elaborate on how this can be done in reality and how monitoring and evaluations could help in this regard?
No, thank you for your question. So as I mentioned, we have to allow processes to really be what they need to be in each country, which again need not be the same, right? So allowing for that level of flexibility is not just about making things easier, but also about allowing innovation and changes needed after the project endorsement due to either evolving market dynamics or, depending on the case, if a private sector partner cannot be found, and then resources are not taken away, but rather reassigned elsewhere. So I gave the example of SIF's pilot program for climate resilience in Zambia, where this approach, including the country-led design, targeted interventions, and mid-course adjustments was applied. So an overarching strength, I think, of the PPCR work in Zambia has been recognizing the challenges and, based on experience and in response to changing circumstances, adapting accordingly. So even when this entails really acknowledging the limitations and weaknesses that you face and making sometimes difficult course corrections. In the case of Zambia, there was a change from the original SPCR plan for private sector support. So just by way of background, our engagement started with a grant that focused on the formulation of Zambia's strategic program for climate resilience, which is the SPCR I was referring to. So the initial SPCR included a $15 million US project from the IFC for private sector support, and then a series of scoping and bankability assessments were undertaken over a 3-year period to try to identify potential private sector engagements, particularly for mobile phone platforms and weather index insurance, I believe. So ultimately, the IFC felt that there was no suitable investments. So in response, the IFC, together with the government of Zambia and the World Bank, proposed and received an approval from the PPCR governing board to reallocate those funds to support another World Bank implemented project for rehabilitation of priority canals. So this is where your adaptation comes in. So I think this really shows the value of evaluation at different stages of the project, and really learning our way throughout the evaluation cycle and building in, again, as previous colleagues were also saying, that level of flexibility, not only in programming the funds, but also through the project cycle. So from selection to design to M&E, etc., to course correct when necessary, and also do further analysis on that flexibility and build in space for, so to say, those learning reviews. In this case, again, a big lesson particularly was also to consider more proactive and creative ways to engage the private sector, particularly in resilience work across relevant sectors and themes, and that too at various stages of program and project development. But I think the big key here is having that level of flexibility built in the project.
Thank you very much, Sarah. All right, so we will now move to Unikrishnan. Thank you very much for your patience, and we are ready for you. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Yuanji, for first of all, let me thank the organizers of the Climate Week for allowing the Commonwealth Secretariat to present the experiences. So before I start, I think thanks for those great presentations from all the co-panelists, and I think it has very clearly set the stage for the discussion. And of course, we are in time for it, looking at the COP27 discussions ongoing. But it's also like this has been, I mean, I've been involved in multiple evaluation panels with GCF and outside GCF. And I think some of the issues have taken off and have moved forward, but some of the other pertinent issues are still lying where we are, which is not so encouraging. But I think the continued effort, I think that's more important. And so the Commonwealth Secretariat is standing as a practitioner here from the level of country engagement and our experiences. We do conduct a lot of internal and external third-party evaluations, basically to guide our programs and support to the 56 member countries, as Yonji explained in the beginning. So I would like to speak about the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub. So again, the unique distinguishing features of the Climate Finance Access Hub has also evolved a lot, and has been because of multiple evaluations where the need for more country demand driven approach is what we've adopted with high emphasis on embedded action, because basically countries are very clear that we need support at the country for a long-term basis, so that it can result in change. And of course, we need a balanced approach in human and institutional capacity building for climate finance project structuring, and of course, partnerships, as many of us have talked about, and also interconnected networks. So what you see on the right side is the hub and spokes model, where we have the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub, which is thanks to the government of Mauritius, that we are housed within the government. And we have regional hubs catering to the Indo-Pacific region, sitting with the International Solar Alliance, for the Caribbean region sitting with CARICOM, and for the African region sitting with the AUD and NAPED. And these are the countries where we are currently present. So we have supported more than 16 countries, and good to see Christopher Bartlett from Vanuatu. We are also supporting Vanuatu in the process of climate action. So we work on 5 pillars, again, on concrete adaptation and mitigation project development, climate policy development support, climate finance readiness, and human and institutional capacity development, including accreditation support. Yes, many of us mentioned the need for accreditation to enhance the scale of financing, and also knowledge management and learning. So what we have achieved so far is more than 50 million worth of projects that we have accessed for the country governments. Majority of them are in the readiness in the preparatory space, because the small states are largely in the stage of setting up the standards in the country to take the process of access to larger scale financing forward. So I'll, from the experiences point of view, I'll speak about 5 areas with some examples. The first and foremost, as many of us have alluded to, lack of institutional capacities. We've seen it weakening the capacity of member countries to access and the support of development of bankable projects, because we see the institutional capacity is paramount in terms of having 1, long-term action, 2, coordinated action, and 3, to maintain those project proposals, because what we heard also from multiple evaluations is not only the need for finances, but also how far these finances deployed in countries are being used effectively, especially in terms of the usability point of view. And the second aspect is lack of institutional capacity, weakening the capacity of member countries, but highly on the human side of it, actually. So just wanted to highlight this point. And lack of data for successful project proposal submission. Again, we worked with the GCF Independent Evaluation Unit a couple of years back in terms of how we use the Earth observation or satellite data probably for enhanced proposal submissions. The fourth point is we are far behind in gender integration for climate action. So how do we do that? And then last but not least, the private sector engagement for climate action, a distant reality. So we have experienced this in our project preparation support to the member countries, and just will take some examples. So the first point about the lack of institutional capacities. In case of, so we worked with Fiji, the government of Fiji, government of Tonga, and government of Belize. And I would like to take those three examples to give a kind of a response to that. Like, for example, what we have found in the evaluations is that the institutional structuring, if it's not done correctly, there is always going to be a potential threat of siloing of projects. The projects generally go in from one ministry or the other, but definitely leading to less of integrated proposals, which ideally answers the paradigm shift and also the at-scale proposal question. So we developed the blueprint for the project development unit within the Ministry of Economy in Fiji, with the clear intention that it should be an integrated unit that can deal with multi-department, multi-sectoral project proposals of scale. The second aspect that we are looking at in many countries is to work on national trust funds and national funds, which are designed explicitly to take on proposals at larger scale. So we're working with Tonga, we're working with Antigua and Barbuda, we're working with Maldives. So here the intention is to have more of trust funds at scale, which can do innovative work in terms of taking on finances at scale. So in Belize, for example, what we did, and also like we did it in Zambia, is to work with the ministries in developing the investment planning around NDCs and accordingly make the structure to maximize the access to climate finance. We heard from Vanuatu also in terms of the costing, and of course, like the costing need to be linked to the institutional preparedness or the institutional readiness to take on these projects. The lack of human capacities weaken the capacity of member countries to submit proposals at scale. So human capacity building, we have seen in many countries that there are a lot of capacity building efforts, but how do we sustain those efforts in the countries, and how do we convert those efforts into institutional memory or kind of institutional architecture that can take on further? So what we've adopted is a methodology of right shop, which is again not a very new methodology or anything, but it's basically to use the existing project proposals and involve the officials in the government departments to work on these proposals and develop the justifications. Because the government departments, as all of us knows, they have the kind of minute details of every sector and the vulnerabilities there, but to convert them into successful projects requires a lot of connecting to the requirements of the funds that we've heard from GCF, SIF, and Adaptation Fund and others. So this is something which we are currently doing in multiple countries in the Commonwealth. So one aspect that I would like to highlight here is the toolkit to enhance access to climate finance. So this is basically not like a generic what you call prescription, but this is based on the last 6 years of work that we have done with member countries with practical experiences from our advisors. So this is also currently adopted by UNFCCC, and it's being uploaded in the UNFCCC document site, and also the NDC partnership and the others like Africa NDC Hub and others. So this is a very practical guidance toolkit, which not only touches on projects, but also on accreditation, because our advisors have also supported in the process of the fiduciary checks and also on the ESGs and others. So basically, this is more of a hands-on guide that could come handy for countries. And the third bit is lack of data for successful project submission. So we have seen that data is one of the most important aspects in terms of deciding the success of the projects and also deciding the time it takes for the project to move through. So we partnered with UNITAR, which is United Nations Institute for Training and Research, in terms of using the satellite data or the Earth observation data for Fiji, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. So here we're using the satellite data basically to convert the observations to clear justifications, which actually, so there are a couple of projects that are currently being prepared using this. And we also did a discussion paper, and thanks again to the inputs that we received from the Independent Evaluation Unit of the GCF in 2021 for COP26. And so that's also available in the Commonwealth website for reference. And the fourth area is, again, on the gender integration for climate action. So this is, again, an important aspect when it comes to finance, because we all know that customized finance basically for the gender mainstreaming is still not available. And of course, most of these vulnerable categories are out of the financing windows. And that's also one of the reasons why we are still very grant-centric when it comes to adaptation financing. In many of the developing countries, where the business models around adaptations are much robust, especially from agriculture, water sector, etc., compared to the small island development states. But still, this is one aspect that we are evaluating based on the NDC submissions, and we have seen that many of the resubmitted NDCs did bring a great amount of rigor in bringing the gender mainstreaming aspects into the NDCs and also the financing angle. So we are also coming out with a guidebook basically to ensure that customized financing is needed. And this is basically also going to impact the way the banking sector is thinking, especially the development financial institutions, in terms of how do the prudential banking norms look at integrating vulnerable classes into their lending portfolio, which is, I think, the larger question of green banking. And the last bit is private sector engagement for climate action. So this is, again, an important aspect that we're dealing with. And we also note with great enthusiasm the private sector engagement conference that is being organized by GCF, and will very actively participate there. So one aspect that we have observed in our work in Eswatini, which is another country in the African region, is to work with the government to see how we enhance the private sector engagement. In that process, we realized that because we heard the kind of figures around co-financing from private sector into the projects. The reality when we work with countries and with the private sector is that the pace at which the private sector investment happens and the pace at which the private sector return on investment is needed is sometimes not matching with the pace at which the governments move. So that actually brings us to that situation where the investment planning as a need to go hand in hand with the private sector investment cycles. So this is something which we are trying to do in some of the sectors, and thanks to the great effort from the government of Eswatini, that we are able to take this kind of a work forward for the country. But definitely looking at the kind of scarce financial resources and the need for innovative financing, definitely private sector engagement is going to be an important aspect, and without which I don't think we'll be able to hit the scale that we are looking at for countries, looking at the gap that, for example, Vanuatu highlighted. So these are the 5 areas, and in this short time would like to bring forth these observations. I know these are age-old areas of discussion, but would like to definitely bring it back to the focus for this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Unnikrishnan. So yeah, this has been truly like very rich discussion with all the panelists as well. And so we only have about 10 minutes left. And I just want to encourage all of you participants to send us a few questions. Maybe we can entertain a question or two before we have to do wrap up and closing. But while waiting for your questions to arrive, Unnikrishnan, maybe I can ask you this question. So how exactly is the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub supporting your member countries in overcoming the various human and institutional capacity gaps in enhancing access to climate finance?
Yeah. No, I think for Commonwealth, as you said, 56 member countries, that's our strength, because basically we have countries at different stages of implementation of climate action. So we have countries like who are highly on the financing side of it, to countries who are like really into the landlocked side of it, dealing with the land related issues, countries having large ocean states who are working on ocean related aspects. So the hub and spokes model that we follow enables the seamless sharing of information between the countries. I think that's a very quick way of sharing of information, not only for replication, but also for deepening and upscaling of some of these work in the country. So obviously, and we also do have an advantage of having the member countries coming together twice a year as the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, where we get a lot of opportunities to engage and get inputs from the governments in terms of what they require from the hub. So it's more of a guided system, but at the same time, we do have seamless what you call knowledge exchange possibilities that helps us to share information. So all the models that I've just and examples that I've just discussed, even if it's done for 1 or 2 countries, we do have a great scope of replicating it, and those are currently being evaluated to see how well these efforts need to be financed at scale. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Unikrishnan. So, all right, I still don't see any questions from the audience, but I know that Anastasia, you raised your hand earlier, so I will give you an opportunity to ask any questions to the panelists.
Okay, thanks, Yanchi, got me on the spot, but I had a question to Martin, actually, for his interesting finding and quite counterintuitive finding that vulnerability is not correlated with the amount of German aid, right? What do you think? Why is that? And what could be other correlated factors in that equation?
So can I answer directly?
Of course. Just go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Anastasia, for this question. Yes, so I mean, the first finding was, the probability increases with the vulnerability status, but the amount of funding didn't increase as much as expected when taking the different levels of vulnerability. So the vulnerability status actually is not the main determinant for the amount of money that partner countries receive. And I indicated one other finding, donor herding. So it seems to matter more when other donors are around, that Germany provides more funding, which was also counterintuitive on the one hand, but on the other hand, of course, in our modeling approach, we couldn't fully segregate the German funding flows from all the flows of the other donors. So it might be that this is a very coherent picture in a country, and others step in and provide funding that is needed based on the vulnerability status, but it's not Germany providing this amount of funding alone, but in the concert of together with other donors. So this is something we are still working on, which we're not really able to control fully for all the different influences in our models.
All right, we have a question from the audience. So this question to Mr. Christopher Bartlett. So how is the government of Vanuatu mitigating the risk, climate change, injustice of climate finance funding in terms of gender and indigenous communities?
Yeah, yes, thank you very much for that question. I think it's a really important one. And we heard from some of the other panelists about the gaps in investing in women in indigenous communities. If you have a look at Vanuatu's new NDC, you'll notice that there's an entire section on gender. And I think it's probably one of the highest sectoral areas in commitments. I think there are 11 very specific commitments on gender, where the Vanuatu government and sectors across the board have prioritized mechanisms and processes to ensure that the priorities and needs of women, girls, and even the LGBTQI trans community have the investments required and the actions required to address their climate needs. Also in that document, you'll find for the first time, as far as I'm aware, in any NDC from the Pacific, a section on indigenous communities. And of course, the majority of our population is indigenous and experience particular gaps and needs when it comes to addressing climate change. So I think these are just small steps, putting these priorities in the highest level policy document, which then hopefully will lead to the investment that's required, but certainly not the first steps that are already have been taken by governments, including government of Vanuatu.
All right, thank you very much. So, okay, let's see if there's another question. Okay, great. So now I would like to propose that, unfortunately, given the time limits, we have to do a wrap up and closing. And before we do that, I would like to remind all participants to kindly take the pop-up survey that you will see immediately after the session closes. So yeah, that's a request from the Asian Evaluation Week Secretariat. So please kindly do that. So now, as an effective way of doing a wrap up, I would like to ask the presenters and also panelists to summarize in one word or in one sentence what your key takeaway has been. So if someone were to ask you, okay, tell me straight, how can we make climate finance and adaptation work for the SIDS and LDCs? What are you going to tell them, given all the reflections we've had, the discussions we've had here in this session? So I will go first to Susumu.
Thank you, Yonji, and thank you all the participants for the great discussion. Okay, I would say that the need for quality data for evaluation that we repeated during this discussion. We know that the data is limited, but we need data to inform and also inform decisions and also for the learning purpose.
Thank you. That was very good. Okay, so we need more data from the evaluations. All right, so next, Anastasia.
Yes, thank you, Yonji, and thank you, everyone. And following up what Susumu was saying about data is understanding the needs of the people who are most vulnerable. I think this is the most important thing. So understanding the gaps in the needs and focus specifically on that.
So focus more on the vulnerability. So I really don't know why the vulnerability is not really matching the finance that's actually flowing. So that was also surprising for me. But all right, so next, Chris, go ahead.
Well, thank you to the experts on this panel. I learned so much. The diversity and flexibility of processes in different countries, the gaps in human and institutional capacity, the fact that it's not just about scale, but it's the effectiveness of those investments, the importance of having these independent evaluations came out very strongly. And of course, this transformational shift in the perspective of climate finance, not as charity, but as an obligation of states to protect human rights. So much in this panel. Thanks so much.
Yes, indeed, it has been very rich. So thank you for that. Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, so the word cloud in my mind actually definitely includes climate justice, human rights-based approaches, a paradigm shift and transformative change, but also access and learning as well as evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah.
Thank you. It's been such a rich discussion. I think particularly in the investment planning phase, at least the use of a programmatic approach, as we've seen, has had significant advantages over a project by project approach. So really bringing together different partners and climate funds essentially for joint programming, and also supported through clear guidance mechanisms and resources is very effective. And we've seen that. And really, again, building in that level of flexibility, as colleagues have mentioned, all the way through the project cycle is important.
Thank you. And next, Unikrishnan.
Yeah. For me, I think a multilateral approach for climate action to support member countries in enhancing access to climate finance is one of the most important elements with full country ownership, actually. So that only, I think, will lead to more lasting solutions in the countries.
Thank you for that. All right, so there you have it, our key takeaways from this session. And just let me quickly comment that one of the things we discussed was programmatic approaches, as Sarah said, and this is really relevant for us, the GCF folks here, because we don't have a policy yet on programmatic approaches. We just have a draft policy. And so we've been thinking ourselves how the work can be made more effective, how it could be faster. And then I think when it comes to adaptation, the burden of demonstrating climate rationale for these, SIDS and LDCs, it has been truly great, right? Whereas I heard from also the ground that for a lot of SIDS countries, climate equals development, because climate change poses threats to development. And for them, it's the same, they need to tackle both. And so I think we were able to discuss all the different aspects of, supporting adaptation in SIDS and LDCs. So it's been truly wonderful and really rich. All right, I think we all said what we need to say. So thank you so much. Please remember to take the pop-up survey. And then I hear from the Secretariat that there is session 15, which will be taking place quite soon. So please do join that session as well. From all of us at the IEU, we thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this session just as much as we did. And so I will see you all later and perhaps see you at the COP as well. So thank you.